For as long as I've lived, I've always been in my hometown, a small community that not many people even know exists. But my parents never used to live here. They moved just before I was born. They always told me they wanted a quieter life, and they found it in this remote little hamlet. My parents moved with a lot of savings, but they knew it wasn't smart to dip into saved money to live, so my father worked a local job and my mum stayed at home to look after me. They figured it would be harder for them to both work, only to have to pay for a carer, so this was their best solution. My dad initially worked as an apprentice tradesman, but eventually he became a prolific worker throughout the town. If anyone needed something fixing, he was often the first to call. Growing up, they adored me. I was a lone child, but I never felt alone growing up. After school, I played a lot with my father. He made sure he would always spend time with me after he finished work. My mother would care for me when Dad wasn't around. Looking back, I don't know how he had the energy. He worked a grueling amount of hours, enough to make a 9-to-5, 5 days a week worker look like they were part-timers. This was a sad necessity when you live in such a small place. You can't exactly become an entrepreneur when everyone is busy with their own lives and the local economy isn't exactly blessed with a heap of rich people. When I started properly making friends, my dad was initially chagrined at the idea of me spending more time with James and Martin. However, he quickly realized that I should be spending time with kids my age, and he never wanted to be controlling. This was a theme they kept up to present day. They let me live my own life, something I thank them for, especially when I hear the horror stories of helicopter parents or uptight guardians. The town was small, and in some ways not very progressive, so there were many elders that believed in a sterner way of bringing up kids. My parents weren't brought up locals, and they recognized that kids should be kids. The families in this town are big. A lot of families have members that never want to leave. It's hard to describe the charm of living here, but you get a sense of community that makes you want to stay. As a result of this, some families are huge. James had a lot of cousins, and so did Martin. However, I was the odd one out. It was just my mom, my dad, and me. Growing up, I would ask them about this. Why didn't we have any family here? At first, they shot back with the obvious. They moved here, so family were elsewhere. The older I got, the more questions I'd add. If our family isn't here, where are they? Questions like these made them always fall to silence and redirect the question. Eventually, I learned to give up. Nowadays, they moved away. When I became an adult, they gave me the option to go with them or to stay in the hamlet. To their shock, I chose to stay. Despite the tragedy I lived through, this was still my home. I had no desire to leave it, yet. It hasn't been long, but that's how it's been. I've lived alone, living my small town life, and my parents are now city people again, living shoulder to shoulder in the bustling streets. When I contacted them out of the blue, they were pleasantly surprised when I said I wanted to visit them. Even until recently, I'd never shown any desire to leave my town. Every time I saw them since we parted, it had always been them visiting me. So, when I suggested that I might visit them for a weekend, they were over the moon. It saddened me, knowing the real reason I chose to do this. I made sure to have a good day with them before digging and prying the truth out of them. We went out, had a great time, ate a meal, and settled with a movie. The day after, the mood was different. I sat them down. In my head, I had planned a grandiose speech about everything that happened, detailing all my hard work, the secrets I uncovered, the skeletons I aired out. But in the end, I looked at them. Unanimously, they were happy. I didn't want to take that away just to stroke my ego or possibly hurt them unjustly. Instead, I brought up the subject in a lighter tone. At first, I asked about our family. Again, they turned at this. They danced around the subject, never revealing anything I never knew before. The same question, the same response. But it was exactly that. Always the same question. In that moment, I finally thought of the correct question to shoot. Who is A. Carlson? Immediately, the colour drained from their face. Whatever the answer was, it was serious. At first, they tried again to verbally dance away. Then they went back to their old story that it was a distant uncle they don't talk to anymore. However, I pressed them, and with a look of concern, they opened up. The tale they told was something I never expected. They opened with something no child wants to hear. I wasn't exactly planned. They had accidentally conceived and were completely unprepared for a child. My heart silently sank when I realized I was considered for an abortion, but they couldn't bring themselves to do such a thing. The option they settled on was to give me up to a couple that couldn't conceive and bless them with a family they wanted. That way, my parents could get on with their lives, and a wanting couple can feel whole. While my mother was pregnant, they started interviewing couples through some sort of agency to vet out who their progeny was going to go to. They eventually settled on a loving couple that stood out from the rest. The Carlsons. It was a husband and wife. They were close as can be. They immediately fell in love with how similar they all were. My mom apparently had a similar face shape to Mrs. Carlson. They had similar hair colour, similar height. My dad was the spitting image of Mr. Carlson too. Because of this, they felt it was destiny for them to inherit the baby. Me. From then on, they had multiple interviews, and the Carlsons aced them. They had a great life. Mr. Carlson worked as a local architect, and Mrs. Carlson baked custom cakes from home. They had supported families that were on standby to help if they needed, and they had a nice house with a spare bedroom. It was a sad day when they found out they couldn't have a baby. But when they decided to scope out the adoption route and met my parents on the first try, they claimed it was a strong fate for this to happen. Though some people have quirks, my parents said there wasn't anything inherently wrong with either of them. They were perfect. Further into my mom's pregnancy, the strangest thing happened. My mom and dad fell further in love. The whimsical way they described it was some paternal and maternal feeling came over them one day. My mother was lying down, feeling a bit under the weather, so my father booked work off, refusing to take no as an answer, and spent the day with her, caring for her. Doing something so selfless for my dad, and feeling so cared for by my mom, made them realize maybe they should give the family idea a shot. They made plans to permanently move in together, and talks of marriage was already on the table. there was only one last loose end to tie up: the Carlsons. It wasn't easy to bring up. The Carlsons' hopes were high. They had an almost zealous enthusiasm about inheriting me. So, when my parents broke the news to them, it was understandable they'd be upset. Mrs. Carlson was shocked at first, yet was apparently understanding about the whole thing, even showing signs of happiness for my parents. Mr. Carlson, however, was a different story. He was irate. Through clenched teeth, he went off that I was to be his, that I had already been promised, that it was their destiny. He needed a child. It was fate that brought them together. He wasn't going to let that be torn apart so easily. From then on, the harassment started. It started small, constant calls and texts for my parents to reconsider, to have a child when my parents were ready, and that the Carlsons were ready now. He almost went through the 5 stages of grief: in denial, then quickly onto anger, harassing my parents to no end. He bargained everything, even offering things he couldn't possibly commit to. He offered everything in his life: his home, his car, his servitude. Mr. Carlson just wanted his kid. I want to say he got depressed and eventually accepted it, but he never got that far in the grieving process. Things only got worse. My parents refused to get into the grittier details, but knowing the things I found, I trust that it started to get ugly. This all culminated in my parents saving their money and secretly moving to the small hamlet where I was born. That made something click in my head. Why my parents, who never showed signs of truly being small town people, had moved and lived where I grew up for so long. They weren't looking for a quiet place to raise me. They were trying to get away from him. They heard that the Carlsons had divorced in their absence. Mrs. Carlson must have gotten sick of him, or worse, scared. And that was the last they heard about them. Until my 10th birthday. When I got the present of a camera and a note, this hit them much harder than they let on. My parents were scared that he somehow found them, fearful of my safety. Above all else, the biggest thing they feared were the questions. They were happy that I took them at their word that A. Carlson was an estranged uncle, and it was left at that. After that, they took the steps to officially file a restraining order against him. After showing a fraction of the evidence they had, it was very quickly put through. From then on, they never heard from him, and to this day, they haven't. To my parents, they succeeded. Afterwards, I didn't know what to think. I refused myself to bring up anything until I thought about how to go about this. So, I thanked them for the truth, and not long after, I left. When I got home, I picked a day I was free, packed a full bag, and went on another walk in the woods. With my blood pumping and fresh air pushing out the city pollution out of my lungs, I walked and thought. So much was swimming through my head. On one hand, they knew about A. Carlson the whole time, yet at the same time, they never knew what he was truly up to. They never knew how crazy he really was. Were they really to blame for any of this? Even now that I've had some time to think more, I've concluded that no. I don't think they could have prevented anything. Mr. Carlson was crazy. He was oddly manic at the idea of getting me. He somehow saw a delusional salvation in me. and my parents did the best they could with what they knew to keep him away. My parents essentially threw away their lives to keep me, even going as far as losing contact with their family, something I hope they reconcile one day. In the end, I also chose not to go to the police. To bring up the past would, in some ways, make both my parents and Martin complicit. Despite Martin doing everything he did, I don't hold it against him. In the end, he was manipulated. He was groomed. He didn't know he was putting James and I in danger. He thought he was doing good for himself and us. Call it naivety, but I never want to think of Martin as a bad person in all of this. It would upset my parents too. If there was an investigation, they would feel an immense amount of guilt about everything that went down. I truly believe they did their best. To imply that they failed would dampen their souls. I never want to sour any years of their lives after they did so much for me. Besides, Mr. Carlson is dead. James's family have had 10 years to mourn. My parents had the family life they dreamed of. Martin sadly atoned for his transgressions by his own hand. It's almost serendipitous. I've lived through this renewed journey, digging up old wounds, finding both metaphorical and literal skeletons of the past. I managed to solve what could be the greatest mystery of our town. But I'm choosing to never tell them. No matter how much I think about it, it's best this way. There's no use digging up the past anymore. To tell my parents, the locals, or the police would only bring pain. Because it's over. It's time to bury it. I eventually made it back to the hut, the directions memorized only by me. I opened my bag and pulled out the reason I came back. A shovel. I buried James, hoping to give him the peace he deserved. It would have been sick to leave him in the clutches of that monster. Though only James was buried there, I held a vigil for Martin, James, and my childhood. On top of his burial, I left our childhood Ninja Turtle figures that I found, the totems of our youth, to be forever laid to rest, together. Afterwards, I buried Mr. Carlson, not out of respect, but out of family duty. This was my family's dark past, and by burying him in an unnamed grave away from James's, I hoped to erase him from existence, only remembered by the trees. There was a good outcome though. I've walked into my forest of nightmares. I adventured deep into the thicket of my past. I tackled the monster that resided in the oaks. And I came through to the other side, a new person. I finally had my closure. And in a way, that's what this was all about.